I've been thinking this week about a certain concept from business management. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. The concept is called universal design. Now, even if you're not familiar with the concept called universal design, I suspect that you have universal design in your kitchen drawer. If you look at and bring up the image, how many of you know what this is? How many of you have one in your kitchen drawer? This is the first carrot peeler that the company called OXO made. Do you know how it was started? In the late 80s, an older couple was making dinner in their kitchen together, and the wife was using that old-style carrot peeler. Do you remember the old? You got to be over 40, I think, to remember it. It was the little metal one that was kind of flimsy, and the edges of the handle were actually kind of sharp. It was very hard to use, and she was having difficulty using that carrot peeler, and so the two of them started looking at it, and she happened to be a designer. So she went into her studio and she grabbed a hunk of clay and she wrapped the clay around that handle, and that is how OXO was born. That's the carrot peeler. And if you have an OXO utensil in your drawer, you notice how comfortable it is in your hand? The reason she was struggling to use that old carrot peeler is that she had developed arthritis in her hands, and it was very painful for her to use. And so they started this company called OXO based on the principle of universal design. And the principle goes like this: if we can make our product or the service we provide the most comfortable and easy to use for the customer who is most vulnerable among us, it will make that product or service better for everyone. You don't have to have arthritis in your hands to feel how comfortable the OXO carrot peeler feels in your hand, because it makes life better for all of us. I'm thinking about universal design because the place where I work, EverTrue, formerly known as Lutheran Senior Services, a couple of years ago, our CEO, Adam Marles, challenged us to use universal design in the services and communities we provide. The people we serve, the most vulnerable among us, are people who have a diagnosis of dementia. And so he challenged us to say, how can we provide best-in-class, world-class service, care for those people who have dementia? And if it holds true, then that will lift up the lives of all the people we serve. And so we started an initiative called Still You. And if you've been to Merrimack Bluffs, a few of you actually live there, you will notice that we started a whole community, a whole village for people who have a diagnosis of dementia where they can live their best life. Not only are we providing best-in-class care and support for them, but we have found ways to empower their lives so that they can live their best life with purpose and fulfillment, even in the midst of dementia. Life is better for all of us when life is good for the most vulnerable among us. I'm thinking of universal design because the prophet Jeremiah. When the prophet Jeremiah talks about life in exile, he has in the back of his mind what is in the back of the mind of all the Hebrew prophets, all the way back to Moses, that the prophets were always reminding the people of Israel of those groups among them who were most vulnerable. There were 4 of them. Do you know who they were? Orphans, widows, the poor, and the foreigner. The Hebrew prophets were always reminding the people of Israel that if you care for those 4 groups of people, the orphan, the widow, the poor, and the foreigner, life will be better for all of you. That's God's universal design. The orphan, the widow, the poor, and the foreigner. And that would have been enough. I will leave you to draw your own conclusions about what that would mean for us in our contemporary society, but that would have been enough, except that 500 years later, another Hebrew prophet comes along, this one named Jesus of Nazareth, and he will take it to a whole nother level. He will take it to a whole nother level by including two other groups that had never been included before. You only have to get about 6 words into today's gospel reading, and you heard it. Did you hear it? Jesus will choose to associate with tax collectors and other notorious sinners. Jesus will take it to a whole nother level. Why? Well, first of all, that's just what Jesus does. But I think one of the reasons why is because of the week we just experienced. Jesus will take it to a whole nother level because in the midst of our community life together, the cycles of violence will just keep on spinning. The cycles of violence and conflict and fighting and backbiting and resentment and envy and anger and hatred and fear. All of these cycles will keep on spinning, and Jesus takes it to another level because he wants to break that cycle. He wants to break that cycle of violence and anger and resentment and envy and conflict and hatred and fear. And so he will go to the tax collectors and the other notorious sinners. And just so we don't feel like any of us get off the hook, it's the religious folks, ironically, who most resent and despise the fact that Jesus is doing this, the ones who knew the Hebrew prophets the best. Just to remind ourselves that none of us gets off the hook, Jesus is an equal opportunity offender. For those who were standing there in first century Palestine, who had sensibilities that, let's just say they were a little left of center, let's call them progressives. We can even call them Democrats. They resented the fact, they despised the fact that Jesus was hanging out with tax collectors because the tax collectors were the agents of all the systems of oppression and injustice that were afflicted upon the poor, the ones who didn't deserve it, the ordinary people. But for those who are standing there in first century Palestine who may have leaned a little right of center, we can call them conservatives, maybe Republicans. They resented the fact, they despised the fact that Jesus would hang out with these other notorious sinners like prostitutes because they were the ones who offended every moral sensibility we would have about what it means to live a pure, upright, righteous life as a citizen. Jesus is an equal opportunity offender. He lets none of us off the hook. It actually even reminds me of a quote by the writer Anne Lamott. It's a quote that comes from her book, Bird by Bird, and it cut me to the quick when I first read it, and it still cuts me to the quick every time I come across it. Do you want to hear it? Yeah. Verbatim, this is what Anne Lamott writes. You can safely assume that you have created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do. Cuts me to the quick. I don't know about you. But that is why Jesus is taking it to another whole nother level, because none of us get off the hook. And that's why he tells these two parables. The second one is the one I think we more easily identify with. Who in your family is that woman who will clean every corner of the house, who will search every nook and cranny just to find a lost nickel? Maybe it was an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent who lived through the Great Depression. Maybe it's you. We all have that person, right, who will search through the house to find just that little nickel. But I think all of us know the joy of finding something that was lost. Maybe you have little children who play with Legos, and they lose that one minifig, and you have to search every nook and cranny, otherwise there will be crying and gnashing of teeth for days on end. But then when you find it, there is rejoicing in heaven by all the angels. I think we all know that joy. The first parable, though, is a little more difficult because who in their right mind leaves behind 99% of their inventory to chase after 1%? The managers among us would remind us that's just the cost of doing business. Sometimes you just lose 1% of your inventory and it's best to just move on. As a matter of fact, it would have been the same for those first century Palestinians who were standing there. It would have been scandalously foolish for any of them to have done what the shepherd did, to go after the one and leave the 99 in the wilderness. That's where the wolves were. It's scandalously foolish for a shepherd to do a thing like that. Unless you happen to be one who knows the feeling of what it's like to be left completely alone. Unless you have been the one who has been left utterly behind. Unless you know the experience of being completely lost in the wilderness, then you are the one to know that Jesus will be the one who will not leave you behind. Jesus will be the one who will seek you out wherever you go until you are found. Jesus will be the one to show you that you are never alone. If that is you, then I think you know also what it means to hear the opposite of Anne Lamott's quote. The opposite of it is this: you can safely assume that God, you have met the one true living God, when it turns out that God is calling you to love the ones you most want to hate. Because that's how God breaks the cycle. That's God's universal design. Love. It's the only way we know how to break the cycle that keeps spinning. The cycles of envy, resentment, anger, hatred, conflict, fighting, fear. Love is the only way we know how to break the cycle. And why? How? Because it's at the end of the Gospel of Luke that God will break all those cycles. When those same religious folks who despise who Jesus hangs out with will heap upon his shoulder, they'll send him out into the wilderness on his own, all alone, and they will heap on his shoulders all the cycles of violence and conflict and anger and hatred and fear, and they will kill him for it. But that is how God will break the cycle. 3 days later, he will raise Jesus from the dead, and God will put to death all those cycles of conflict and fighting and anger and resentment and hatred and fear. God will put them to death by raising Jesus from the dead. And the power of the life of the resurrection is what will break the cycle. And it didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. It happened just a few minutes ago. The power of the life of the resurrection was just poured into the life of River. The power of the life of the resurrection is now in her heart. And guess what? The power of the life of the resurrection is in your heart too, and mine. That is how God will break the cycle. The power of the life of the resurrection inside of us, flowing through us as we what? Love our neighbor. As we even love the one we would otherwise most want to hate. And even more than that, as we love the ones that the powers of this world hate the most. That's God's universal design. It's how we break the cycle. The miracle of it is that when we look upon the face of our neighbor, as Pastor Steve said last week, one person helping one person in person. When we look into their face, we are looking into the face of Jesus himself. And the miracle of it is that just as much as we are loving them, they are loving us too. In Jesus' name, amen.